Hr Pdc members and guests, welcome to our May 20 Hr Pdc meeting. Pursuant to the declared state of emergency in the Commonwealth of Virginia in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and to protect the public health and safety of commission members, staff, and the general public, today's meeting is being held electronically via Zoom. These electronic meetings are required to complete essential business on behalf of our region. Per the requirements of the Code of Virginia, we posted a meeting agenda, supporting documentation on the HRPDC website for public review. We also provided electronic copies of this information to our commission members and other interested parties. Chair McClellan and commission members, I will report that we received one public comment for today's meeting. And when we get to the public comment point on the agenda, I will read that into the record. As a reminder, today's meeting is being live streamed and is available for viewing on the Regional Connection YouTube channel. The meeting is also being recorded and will be available for viewing after the meeting through the HRPDC website. Before we begin today's meeting, just a couple of housekeeping rules. We ask that all participants remain on mute with their phones and computers until called upon by the chair to provide input. After speaking, please remember to go back on mute. Please identify yourself when speaking or providing a motion or a second. And as a reminder, all votes taken today during this electronic meeting must be made by roll call vote and recorded as such in the minutes. Chair McClellan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate that. I want to make a couple of welcomes, if I can, to two of our new commission members, Ms. Carol Steele, Acting County Administrator from Gloucester, and Councilman John Moss from the City of Virginia Beach. Also wanted to note we have some of our state legislators that we've invited to join us today. And right now I see Senator Spruill. Thank you for coming. And I think I see Delegate Miaris as well. I'm looking around to see if there's anybody else at this point. I don't know that I see them, but I'm excited that our regional delegation has also joined us to talk about these important issues today, particularly as it relates to housing and our coastal master plan. So without further ado, we need to then move into the next agenda item, which is the approval and modification of our agenda. So I'd entertain a motion in a second to approve the agenda as presented.
Madam President, Ella Ward, I approve the agenda as printed.
Okay, there's a motion. Is there a second?
Mayor Price, second.
Thank you, Mayor Price. Are there any questions or discussion? Seeing and hearing none. Ms. Arledge, will you conduct the roll call vote, which will also double as our attendance? Well, excuse me, one second. Mr. Stallings, you had your hand raised?
Not on purpose.
Well, let's put that on the Zoom bingo card for today. Okay. Ms. Arledge, would you read the roll call?
City of Chesapeake, Councilman Best,
Yes.
Councilwoman Ritter,
Yes.
Dr. Ward,
Yes.
Mr. Price,
Yes.
Mr. Geis,
Yes.
Franklin, Mayor Rabel,
Yes.
Ms. Jarrett, Gloucester, Supervisor Bazzani, Ms. Steele,
Yes.
Hampton, Mayor Tuck,
Aye.
Councilman Brown,
Aye.
Ms. Bunting,
Aye.
Isle of Wight, Supervisor Acree,
Yes.
Mr. Keaton,
Yes.
James City, Supervisor Eisenhower, Mr. Stevens.
Aye, and Mr. Eisenhower will be joining a few minutes late.
Thank you. Newport News, Mayor Price,
Aye.
Councilman Jenkins,
Aye.
Ms. Rolfe,
Aye.
Norfolk, Mayor Alexander, Councilwoman Doyle,
Aye.
Councilwoman Johnson,
Aye.
Chair McClellan,
Aye.
Dr. Filer, Pecosin, Mayor Helsel, Mr. Wheeler, Portsmouth, Mayor Glover, Ms. Jones, Smithfield, Mayor Williams, Mr. Stallings,
Aye.
Southampton, Supervisor Gillette, Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
Suffolk, Vice Mayor Bennett, Mr. Moore,
Yes.
Surrey, Supervisor Elliott, Ms. Rollins, Virginia Beach, Mayor Dyer, Councilwoman Henley,
Aye.
Councilman Jones, Councilman Tower, I'm sorry, Councilman Moss, Councilwoman Wooten, Mr. Duhaney, Williamsburg, Mayor Pons,
Aye.
Mr. Trivett,
I think he's not been admitted to the meeting yet, but he's online.
York County, Supervisor Knoll, Mr. Morgan.
Aye, and Ms. Knowles should be joining us shortly.
Okay. Mr. Trivett, have you joined us?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes the roll call.
Thank you, Ms. Arledge. Appreciate it. We'll move then on to agenda item number 3, public comments. Public comments were invited in advance of the meeting by email or phone, and we've received one in advance of 48 hours before the meeting. Mr. Crum, would you read that comment into the record, please?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. This comment comes from Mr. Mark Godoldig-Yatrovsky, resident of Portsmouth. Chair, honorable commissioners, and regional neighbors. Although many of us would like to believe that we are nearing the end of the COVID-19 emergency, the like of which we may not see again for another century, I would not want to bet my family nest egg on either of these suppositions. Rather, I think we should be maintaining a running inventory of effective coping strategies so that when we return to a reasonable approximation of what passed for normalcy in the anti-COVID era, we should codify what we've learned and keep the documentation on a readily accessible portion of our emergency preparedness shelf. In that context, I urge you to modify your current virtual meeting procedures in 2 respects. 1, by providing a real-time technological means to address the board during the public comment portion of each meeting. And 2, creating an electronic sign-in sheet by which those viewing the board meetings contemporaneously with the proceedings could register their presence. These 2 modifications would bring the virtual and in-person procedures into closer alignment for the remainder of the current emergency, but also would lay a foundation for off-site public and ideally board member participation post-pandemic. I recognize that changes to the Virginia Freedom of Information Act provisions would be necessary for board members routinely to participate remotely. I believe, though, that multiple benefits would accrue to those members, not the least of which is increased personal productivity due to reduced travel time. Please let me know if you need additional information. Again, from Mr. Mark Godoldig-Yatrovsky. Madam Chair, those are the only public comments that we received.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate that. I think those are some interesting ideas, and I do think that as we move forward, as you present your budget today, one of the things we're going to be looking at is improving our technology to allow for continued use of remote participation. So I think those are timely. Are there any comments from the body as it relates to those words? Okay. Hearing none, Bob, I'm going to turn it back over to you for your executive director's report.
Yes, my monthly report is included in your agenda package. Madam Chair, I do want to mention, I appreciate you recognizing Senator Sproul and others who have joined us from the Hampton Roads Caucus. In addition to the members that you mentioned, we also have received RSVPs from others who will be joining us periodically through the meeting. I just would like to recognize those, in addition to those you mentioned, who also RSVP'd. Senator Jen Higgins, Senator Louise Lucas, Delegate Clinton Jenkins, Delegate Don Scott, Delegate Shelley Simons, and Delegate Gian Ward all indicated that as their schedule allowed, they'll be joining us through today's commission meeting. So I did want to report that. Also, Madam Chair, you'll see an item that I highlighted in my executive director's report about some environmental outreach work that our staff supports through our regional Ask HR Green initiative. This particular outreach program explains the harm that cigarette butt littering can cause for our environment, our water resources, aquatic life, etc. I'd like to ask, if I may, cede my report to our principal in charge of that effort, Ms. Katie Collifer. And I'm just going to stop there and ask Katie if she could please come on and quickly share a screen. I'd like the commission to see how much visibility this program has received. So Katie, I'll turn it over to you. Katie, we're up on the screen, but we aren't able to hear you.
Let me try one more time. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Okay, I'll just keep this brief. Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon. Just, when your job is public outreach during a global pandemic, you tend to think a little bit outside of the box, and that's kind of where this promotion came from. And I can't take a whole lot of credit, from our team. We certainly helped to facilitate this, but the thought behind this came from our committee member in the city of Suffolk, and some work that he's doing locally there brought this to the group for consideration. And the idea here was just to bring about some awareness to some really small items that are a big problem in all of our communities, and that's cigarette litter. So this campaign idea was to blow some cigarette butts up, make them really large so that they can't be ignored, put them out in different places throughout Hampton Roads where people gather, where people would see them in passing with some signage, just to create some awareness about the impacts of cigarette litter and how prevalent they are in all of our communities, and the fact that they get into our waterways and cause harm in that way as well. So that the hashtag No Butts About It campaign kind of came to life that way. We got some PVC pipes and spray foam insulation and some paint and some heat guns, and just rolled our sleeves up, a few of us, to create these large scale model cigarette butts. They're about 2 to 3 feet in size. And we put them in the communities, just in different places. We launched this campaign in a coordinated effort the first week of May. So they were in parks, at recreation centers, they were at libraries throughout the region, public beaches, they were at the Norfolk Zoo, the Virginia Aquarium, Nauticus had them featured. And we had signage accompanying many of them, just illustrating the fact that cigarette butts are the #1 littered item in the US, and that they don't biodegrade. Those filters do have a plastic material in them. They persist in the environment. And the third part of it is that, a lot of times, according to Keep America Beautiful's research, 41% of smokers report that they don't have adequate cigarette receptacles available. So we solved the problem of people smoking public places and pushed them outside, but we don't always provide them with adequate, receptacles and places where they can properly dispose of those. And so that was another facet to this awareness campaign. We had signage that we produced, social media ads that were running throughout our social media channels. And the second part of this was actually a grant program that is open to local businesses and other community groups in order to provide free cigarette waste receptacles for those who would like to get involved and make them available to their staff or to their customers. So we have 100 of these available. People can apply online very easily to receive one of these to put in their place of business to help make proper cigarette disposal an easy thing for the public to do. And the goal was to start a conversation with these large-scale cigarette butts, and that's really what has happened. We've been really pleased to date for the media coverage that we've received. All of our 3 local affiliate stations picked up the news. Even the Richmond CBS affiliate covered this story, to their audience. We've had news coverage from the Pilot and the Daily Press, and a lot of our local tabs and other local channels have picked up news about this promotion and helped us to have the conversation about why cigarette litter is important and the harmful effects that it has on our community. And even some national media channels have picked it up on MSN and Yahoo News. So we've just been really pleased by the response, and this is something that's going to continue happening. I think our unofficial estimate of just the value of this campaign, just to put it in perspective, we're looking at approximately a 1.8 million circulation that have received news about this, and the value of that is about $80,000 if we were to have purchased that type of, that type of coverage on our own. And for a modest budget, we received a $500 grant to produce, to procure the supplies to produce these. Spent about $5,000 of our education budget on the actual receptacles and a little bit for some signage. So we've been really pleased by the response and the value we've gotten back on this campaign. And they're going to continue to pop up in your communities throughout the summer as there are events and places where people gather. We will continue to circulate these along with the important information that goes along with them, and keep the conversation going. So that's all I have to say about it. Thanks, Bob, for the time.
Yes, thank you, Katie. If you wouldn't mind stopping share. Madam Chair, I'll send that back over to you.
Well, first of all, these are what a creative way of getting this message out there. I thought that this was, some big artist had come into town to do this. It looks like you all did it yourselves and did a great job. So Katie, bravo. Terry, you had a comment?
Yeah, this is so much fun. I love it. This is an incredible way to get to everybody. I run a farmer's market in Portsmouth, and I would love to have some of those giant butts there, because every once in a while we smell smoke, and there's no smoking where our market is, but sometimes people just can't help themselves. I think our museums would probably really enjoy this. So if there aren't enough butts to go around, then if we could get instructions for making them ourselves, it could really become a community project. And I love this. This is great. Thank you.
We actually did, as part of our grant, produce a how-to video, and we've heard from even localities as far away as Texas that are interested in doing this themselves. So I will share that in the chat, that link to that how-to video, in case you're interested in making some on your own.
Thank you very much.
That's great. Okay, Bob, any other comments from your report?
No, that will be all. Thank you for the opportunity to share that. And I just want to pause and say Katie is very modest, that Katie and Rebecca are a two-person crew, and I'm continually amazed at what they bring forward in terms of ideas and innovative approach. So job well done, Katie, as always.
No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Sorry. Okay, with that, we'll move back to you, Ms. Terry Danaher, for a report on your committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I do want to mention something. There is some construction work going on next door. So you may either hear some noise behind me or perhaps Pink Floyd, because they are playing music too. So this has been a kind of concert approach to construction. The Community Advisory Committee hasn't met since my last report here, but I did want to mention an ongoing activity, which is the survey that our staff, your staff, sent to our members asking for input on our bylaws and goals, because we've been working on our bylaws and considering our goals as a committee. The response has covered a wide range, but one of the goals was, and I've mentioned this before, bringing community issues that we discuss to you for consideration. And an example of that is a topic that I brought up at the last board meeting, which is having the PDC make a formal request to the Commonwealth for continued electronic access to meetings after the emergency order is lifted. And Mr. Godoldi-Yatrovsky, I've known him for 20 years. I really ought to get that right. Mentioned this in his public comments, which were read to you earlier in this meeting. And there is a strong feeling that this electronic access offers access to our more remote members who have to drive considerable distances or find some way to get here at their own expense over time. And Mr. Godoldi-Yatrovsky's, one of his comments earlier in our meetings was that for people who are not just volunteers, but people who are paid to go to these meetings because it's part of their job, you still have an advantage if you can do some remote meeting because you don't have to travel. So you could actually cut out travel time, which means you could attend more meetings than you would otherwise be able to do. So we're looking at that as a very serious request, which means that I'm requesting that this issue be added to your July agenda. The CAC will meet in June, and we will be talking about this, and we will share our discussion, the results of our discussion with you before your meeting. And then I also wanted to say we've been tweaking our bylaws, but since a change to the rules on electronic meetings would also change our bylaws, we've decided to put those aside for the moment, which is very convenient for us. And we'll wait and see what happens in Richmond. But thank you for your time. That's the end of my report.
Thank you, Ms. Danaher. I do believe there was legislation that went through the last General Assembly that allowed increased remote participation. Maybe we can follow up with that and present that in July as to where that stands and how we might need to adjust our bylaws. Does that work, Bob? We can look at that.
Yes. So very quickly, the action taken by the General Assembly allows public bodies in Virginia to meet remotely as long as the governor's current state of emergency remains in effect. The governor's current state of emergency continues until June the 30th, but we are aware that the governor's office is considering options, including an extension of that state of emergency. So we're working with BML and BACO to continue to monitor that very closely, and we'll be able to give you a report back at your July meeting. So thank you.
Thanks, Bob. I was actually referring to legislation that passed that allows members to call in remotely. So we'll look into what that is, which would provide for some of that. Not the entire meeting, but to the point that was made that there may be some members who have a need or a preference for that and what that looks like. Okie doke. So we will move on then to the consent agenda, which has been presented in advance. Hopefully everybody's had a chance to take a look at that. Is there a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda as presented?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, I think it was moved
Oh,
by
Ella Ward, second.
and seconded by Dr. Ward. Great, thank you. Are there questions or discussion on the consent agenda? Okay, hearing none. Ms. Arledge, will you do a roll call vote?
Chesapeake, Councilman Best,
Yes.
Councilwoman Ritter,
Yes.
Dr. Ward,
Yes.
Mr. Price,
Yes.
Mr. Geis,
Yes.
Franklin, Mayor Rabel,
Yes.
Ms. Jarrett, Gloucester, Supervisor Pisani, Ms. Steele,
Yes.
Hampton, Mayor Tuck,
Aye.
Councilman Brown,
Aye.
Ms. Bunting,
Aye.
Isle of Wight, Supervisor Acree,
Yes.
Mr. Keaton,
Yes.
James City, Supervisor Eisenhower,
Yes.
Mr. Stevens,
Yes.
Newport News, Mayor Price, Councilman Jenkins, Ms. Rolfe,
Yes.
Norfolk, Mayor Alexander, Councilwoman Doyle,
Aye.
Councilwoman Johnson,
Aye.
Chair McClellan,
Aye.
Dr. Filer, Becosin, Mayor Helsel, Mr. Wheeler, Portsmouth, Mayor Glover, Ms. Jones, Smithfield, Mayor Williams, Mr. Stallings,
Aye.
Southampton, Supervisor Gillette, Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
Suffolk, Vice Mayor Bennett,
Yes.
Mr. Moore,
Yes.
Surrey, Supervisor Elliott, Ms. Rollins, Virginia Beach, Mayor Dyer, Councilwoman Henley,
Aye.
Councilman Jones, Councilman Tower,
Aye.
Councilman Moss, Councilwoman Wooten, Mr. Duhaney, Williamsburg, Mayor Pons,
Aye.
Mr. Trivett,
Aye.
York, Supervisor Knoll, Mr. Morgan.
Aye.
That concludes the roll call.
Thank you so much, Ms. Arledge. We'll move on to agenda item 7, which is the fiscal year 22 budget. Mr. Crum has provided that budget. Are you going to go through this, my friend?
Yes, Madam Chair, I'd like to provide an overview for consideration and approval of a proposed budget for fiscal year 2022. This budget comes to you, HRPDC members, upon the recommendation of your joint HRPDC, HRTPO Personnel and Budget Committee. It was approved at a meeting a couple hours ago today by the HRTPO board. So our last step in the process would be to request the approval of this commission today for this proposed budget. As a reminder, we operate on the state fiscal year. This budget would cover the time frame from July 1 of 2021 and conclude June 30th of 2022. Your Personnel and Budget Committee met on April 5 and April 19. As a reminder, here are the members of your P&B committee. They include Ms. McClellan as chair of the PDC, Mayor Tuck as chair of the TPO, the vice chairs of the PDC and TPO, Councilman Jenkins from Newport News, Mayor Rick West from Chesapeake, Mr. Lewis Jones, council member from Virginia Beach, representing our largest jurisdiction, Virginia Beach, Al White, CAO Randy Keaton as the HRPDC treasurer, Mr. Randy Willer represents the CAOs on the peninsula from Poquoson, and Mr. Chris Price, the Southside Chief Administrative Officer. I'd just like to highlight very quickly some of the budget considerations that our Personnel and Budget Committee considered. First off, not unlike all of our local governments, here at the PDC and TPO, we had unexpected budget expenses from COVID in the last year, approaching almost $43,000. What I'd like to stress, though, is that unlike local governments and businesses, we receive no federal relief money to reimburse us for these expenses. So this is something that we've discussed at the Personnel and Budget Committee. We also discussed the need for our websites to be modernized and updated, the need to improve our technology here at the regional building to support regional hybrid meetings where some people might be virtual and some people might be in person. We've talked about our aging agency telephone system and even over $250,000 of repairs and maintenance needs that we have for the regional building and property here. We do own the regional building and adjacent property and have required investments to keep up with those property needs. We talked to the Personnel and Budget Committee about the need for an additional finance department staff person. Our current finance department, led by your Chief Financial Officer, Sheila Wilson, contains 3 staff people. They provide support not only to the HRPDC and HRTPO, but are helping support financially through your Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission over $5 billion of bonding and financing of transportation projects. They also provide financial support to the Military and Federal Facilities Alliance and our new broadband authority. So we are recommending the addition of 1 new finance staff person in our upcoming budget. Salary adjustments we discussed with our Personnel and Budget Committee. Our issues are, of course, to remain competitive and to also deal with salary compression and equity issues, which we believe are becoming a challenge for us with some of our positions. And then last but not least, we talked a lot about our per capita assessment. The locality per capita assessment sits at 80 cents per capita. It was 82 cents per capita, but it was reduced back in 2013 back to 80. And what this has done is kept a pretty flat revenue stream from this funding source. So that's something that we talked about with our Personnel and Budget Committee. So I went over the highlights very quickly. Included in your agenda package were a number of detailed documents providing all the necessary budget information for you to consider, from historical trends to revenue reports to expenditures and fund balance and even reserves. And that information was sent to you in advance so that you could review it to save time during today's meeting. So with that, Madam Chair, I'd just like to review real quickly the highlights of the proposed budget. This budget recommended to you by your Personnel and Budget Committee first provides for an increase in the member per capita dues assessment from 80 cents to 85 cents per capita. Secondly, provides for a 3% salary increase for our staff here effective July 1. Would set aside an additional 1% of total salary, that equals about $42,000, that would allow us to address salary compression and equity issues mid-year, January 1, 2022. And we want to stress, these are for our positions where we have these equity and compression issues. It would not be for management positions like the executive director or deputy executive directors. The budget also provides for that additional finance department position we mentioned, and includes some computer replacement and technology needs to address our organization needs. Some things we have not included in the budget based on direction by Personnel and Budget Committee. For now, we're removing our website upgrades. What P&B asked us to do and look for the most cost-effective approaches to address that work. And finally, the P&B committee said, rather than requesting localities reimburse us for COVID-related costs that were unbudgeted, that a more sustainable strategy was to increase that per capita dues assessment from 80 cents to 85 cents per capita. So, Madam Chair, that I'll conclude with the action requested. We would request that the PDC board consider action to approve the proposed FY 2022 budget as recommended by your HRPDC and HRTPO Personnel and Budget Committee. Madam Chair, I'll send that back over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Crum. Is there a motion and second to adopt the budget as presented?
Move approval, Madam Chair. Ella Ward, Chesapeake.
Thank you, Dr. Ward.
Mayor Tuck, second.
Thank you, Mayor Tuck. Okay, having been moved and properly seconded, are there any questions or discussion on the budget as presented? It's a quiet group today, unless I'm missing a hand somewhere. Nope. Okay, well, with that in mind, Ms. Arledge, would you mind doing the roll call vote?
Chesapeake, Councilman Best,
Yes.
Councilwoman Ritter,
Yes.
Dr. Ward,
Yes.
Mr. Price,
Yes.
Mr. Geis,
Yes.
Franklin, Mayor Rabel,
Yes.
Ms. Jarrett, Gloucester, Supervisor Pisani, Ms. Steele,
Yes.
Hampton, Mayor Tuck,
Aye.
Councilman Brown,
Aye.
Ms. Bunting,
Aye.
Isle of Wight, Supervisor Acree,
Yes.
Mr. Keaton,
Yes.
James City, Supervisor Eisenhower,
Yes.
Mr. Stevens,
Yes.
Newport News, Mayor Price,
Yes.
Councilman Jenkins, Ms. Rawl,
Yes.
Norfolk, Mayor Alexander, Councilwoman Doyle,
Aye.
Councilwoman Johnson,
Aye.
Chair McClellan,
Aye.
Dr. Filer, Pecosin, Mayor Helsel, Mr. Wheeler, Portsmouth, Mayor Glover, Ms. Jones, Smithfield, Mayor Williams, Mr. Stallings,
Aye.
Southampton, Supervisor Gillette, Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
Suffolk, Vice Mayor Bennett,
Yes.
Mr. Moore,
Yes.
Surrey, Supervisor Elliott, Ms. Rawlins, Virginia Beach, Mayor Dyer, Councilwoman Henley,
Aye.
Councilman Jones, Councilman Tower,
Aye.
Councilman Moss, Councilwoman Wooten, Mr. Duhaney, Williamsburg, Mayor Pons,
Aye.
Mr. Trivett,
Aye.
York, Supervisor Knoll, Mr. Morgan.
Aye.
That concludes the roll call.
Madam Chair, the action carries.
Thanks so much. We'll move on to the next agenda item, and I appreciate our delegation, Senator Sproul and Delegate Miyares, for sticking around through all of our business to get to this point. And I want to welcome this item, the Virginia Coastal Resilience Master Plan update. We've got Ann Phillips, Special Assistant to the Governor for Coastal Adaptation with us, Mr. Brian Batten from Dewberry Engineers, and Mr. Dale Morris from the Water Institute of the Gulf. Mr. Crum, did you have further introductions that you'd like to make?
I would recommend we forward it on to Admiral Phillips to help her set the stage for this conversation.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. It's an honor to be here with all of you this afternoon to talk to you about Virginia's Coastal Resilience Master Plan, which I am thrilled to say is now in progress. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I think I'll stick with that for the remainder of the presentation. We discussed who was going to share, and for my colleagues, I'll just keep it, and you all tell me when you need to move forward. So again, thank you, Mr. Crum, Madam Chair, in particular, commissioners and members of the General Assembly who are joining us this afternoon for the opportunity to talk to you about Virginia's Coastal Resilience Master Plan. As Director Crum mentioned, I'm joined today by Dr. Brian Batten, who is the Dewberry Team Program Manager, Project Manager for this effort. Many of you know Dr. Batten. He is well known in coastal Virginia for his work, also well known in coastal North Carolina, and he is a senior coastal scientist and client manager with Dewberry, for those of you who have not yet met him. I'm also joined by Mr. Dale Morris this afternoon. Dale is currently of the Water Institute of the Gulf. However, he is also well known to coastal Virginia, and in particular to the Hampton Roads region, stemming from his work with the Netherlands Embassy, and in particular with the Dutch dialogues, which were conducted here in 2015. Dale joined the Water Institute of the Gulf in May 2018. He's the Director of Strategic Partnerships, and the Water Institute of the Gulf is part of the Dewberry team, who is assisting the Commonwealth with professional engineering services and other support related to our master plan. So we're here to talk to you today about that, which is the beginning, but not the end, of what will become a long-term process, sustainable, evolutionary plan for the Commonwealth to ensure that we adapt and protect our coast. And one last thing as I get going, Director Crum, thank you to you and to Deputy Director Keith Kennedy for your support, assistance, and advice as to get us to this point to the Commonwealth. It's been critical and made a tremendous difference. I would also like to thank the city managers of the cities of Hampton, Norfolk, and Virginia Beach. Way back in December, I presented the master plan framework, which was how we intended to move forward to the city managers, and I asked them for their assistance in providing technical support to the Commonwealth to help us make a decision on how we would work through this professional engineering process. Because of their expertise and the work you all have already done in this context, they stepped forward. They provided very focused, professional, senior people to assist the Commonwealth. Their work made a tremendous difference in the outcomes and the way we were able to move forward with this particular kind of contract, which the Commonwealth had never done before. So thank you all to your cities in particular, and also a special thank you to Virginia Beach, who more than a year ago allowed some of their staff to assist me in sorting out how we would frame this process to move forward. So it does take the collaboration of everyone, and we know as we move forward that in many cases, your localities and planning districts and regional commissions are ahead of the Commonwealth in this context because you've been working so diligently over time at the local level. But what the Commonwealth brings to this and why we want to create a master plan is the opportunity for a whole of government approach, looking across and between what localities and regions are doing to ensure that we're considering equity in that process, knowing that some localities have plenty of capacity and others have no capacity and are still just trying to understand their need, taking a broader view so that we don't inadvertently create actions that will negatively impact one area while positively reducing flooding in another, and then developing a funding strategy to help us move forward across all of this work. We know that the needs are great and the dollars are few. And as the state government, we have an opportunity to not only to coordinate across federal, state, and local to ensure we are maximizing our impact, encouraging equitable treatment of communities who sometimes don't have a voice in this process, can include that voice over time and continue to include it, and align our coastal resilience and environmental protection while making sure we don't leave communities behind. We also want to make sure that we are not inadvertently ignoring our federal partners and other stakeholders across and within the Commonwealth that are so vital to our success, the business community, nonprofits, and of course, community members who are at the heart of the matter. Some of you have heard me speak about the framework that we released in October 2020, and it guides through these 5 guiding principles how we will move forward with our planning process. First of all, acknowledging climate change and its consequences and making decisions on the best available science. I've talked a lot already about equity, but ensuring that we are addressing social inequities and working to enhance and expand opportunities in coastal adaptation and protection that don't inadvertently exclude communities over time. We also understand that we're really focused on green infrastructure and protecting our natural environment. However, green solutions are not the answer to everything. There will be gray, but can we achieve a balance, and can we make those gray solutions as environmentally sound as possible? We also want to utilize community and regional scale planning, and we're particularly interested in incentivizing more than one community, more than one locality, more than one region working together to determine solutions for the greater benefit of all, and prioritizing those solutions and helping to build capacity in areas where there may not be that opportunity right now. And finally, again, addressing the fiscal challenges and focusing on the most cost-effective solutions near term. The longer we wait, the fewer choices we'll have, and the more costly those choices will become. So now is the time to move forward. We are also basing our work on 4 principal goals here, identifying and prioritizing projects that will increase the resilience of coastal communities based on a vulnerability assessment and then the risk to those assets, understanding that vulnerability, developing a financing strategy, all of which Dewberry will help us think through. And by financing strategy, I mean some things we can use state funds to help with, some will have to apply with federal funds, some will be a combination of local funds, but how can we develop a tiered process so that we understand step A, step B, and step C to get to an end to move forward and make progress on things that we know we will need to do. We also want to ensure we're incorporating and promoting climate change projections. We know what's coming, we have tremendous insight as we move forward in coastal adaptation and protection, and then again, coordinating across federal, state, regional, and local adaptation and protection efforts. I'll now turn the presentation over to Dr. Batten and Mr. Morris to introduce their team and their work. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and it's my pleasure to be here today, and it's really our pleasure to be working for the Commonwealth and its stakeholders on this very important effort for the state. A quick overview of our team. Dewberry, we're the lead consultant on this. We're a Virginia-based private firm, and we partnered with several other firms to bring what we thought was the best expertise and also local expertise to the state of Virginia. This includes the Water Institute of the Gulf. We have Del Morris on, as Anne mentioned today, representing them. They bring expertise from the Louisiana Coastal Master Plan, as well as several other coastal resilience efforts in the nation. Vision and Planning and Consulting, who is a emergency management, grants management, and public outreach consulting firm. Small business partner GKY and Associates. We have a mentor protege relationship with them, another Virginia-based firm, and the Miles Agency, who knows many of the stakeholders very well. Hampton Roads region. Next slide, Anne. Thank you. So our challenge, as put forward by the Commonwealth, is to create the first coastal master plan for the state of Virginia. And as highlighted in what the Commonwealth has asked us to do, we're working through a process that's outlined on this slide in about a 7.5-month time frame. So it's very compressed for this first time. We have a very dedicated team who has worked through this on very other studies that's bringing their expertise to the table to accomplish this. But essentially what we're working to do for the Commonwealth is in this first iteration is bring together the investments and data resources from federal, state, local partners, as well as the academic institutions that have touched on this effort for the Commonwealth, and pull them into a consistent framework that the Commonwealth can leverage for the purposes of this plan. That information will be used to complete what's called the master plan analysis, which is comprised of a hazard assessment of looking at future flood hazards and also what impacts those hazards may bring to the state. From there, we are working to establish a database of existing projects that the state has, prioritize those based on a set of factors that are transparent and repeatable, but also using this master plan analysis to identify where projects don't exist and where needs are unmet, and what other items the state needs to work with to bring equity across. This information will be pulled together in the first draft of the Coastal Master Plan, and then we'll be delivering that in the November timeframe. And what a big point of emphasis in what we're doing here is that this is the first Coastal Master Plan for the state of Virginia. And as we work through this whole process in what is admittedly a compressed time frame, a big point of what we'll be doing is identifying gaps and needs and areas of improvement for the future iterations of this master plan. Important to note, as we go through this whole process, we'll be doing outreach and coming out and not only disseminating outcomes, but listening to the needs and the challenges with communities. Next slide, Ann. So our approach, Ann mentioned the Coastal Master Planning Framework in the beginning, and really that is our guidebook for how we're conducting our study, and especially under the guiding principles the state has established and laid out their goals and desired outcomes. With our scope in that framework, we've identified 5 key steps that we're undertaking to accomplish this near-term goal in this first iteration of Coastal Master Plan. And this will involve, one, as I mentioned before, a characterization of existing and future flood hazards, understanding what impacts those hazards will bring to the state, understanding what projects are out there, but also not out there across the state, and where the gaps are and where the opportunities are, a framework to evaluate those projects, and a funding approach. As we work through this whole process, we are engaging with a technical advisory committee that the state has established. Some of you are on that committee to disseminate, to both help advise our effort and bring in their expertise to help us get through this process in terms of the data and the resources and perspectives across the state. We're also working through that public outreach process, and we are iteratively kind of working to develop this master plan document as we go through each phase to be able to complete it in the time frame. Next slide, Ann. Given the time today, we'll do kind of a quick overview of what that scope is, but starting with those items 1 and 2, the hazard and the impact assessment. So the key here, we know that several communities have done very detailed studies, and then there's been other less detailed studies done in other localities. One of the key points here is let's have a statewide consistent set of data that we can overlay on all the communities across the entire state to understand on an even playing field what the risks are existing in future kind of environment. We want to recognize the primary flood hazard drivers to the localities, to the state of Virginia, and these include tidal and nuisance flooding, storm surge. We also want to recognize precipitation, and we're just showing it in gray here because in this first iteration, while it's important and we know how important it is, especially in Hampton Roads with combined flooding, it's just not an item that we can tackle in the amount of time we have on this first iteration, but it will be something we'll come back to in the future. Although we will recognize and include it in what we're doing, we're not assessing it. We're looking at these flood hazards in a range of conditions. We want to start with today to understand what the environment looks like today, what the hazards and impacts are today, and then the framework lays out future timeframes of the 2040s, the 2060s, and 2080s. And then looking at each one of those timeframes, we'll be able to see how these hazards change with climate change and sea level rise, and we'll see how the impacts change. And then what the key point of that will be is looking at these future flood impacts, are we prepared to address them? Do our projects acknowledge them, identify them, incorporate them into their design and planning considerations, and where the gaps are again? This information will be overlaid on 3 primary receptors that we've identified and we're pulling resources together from a variety of sources from the state and federal and other resources. But this looks at people, structures, and ecological systems, the nature-based type environment and resources that the state does have. We're working on these, the kind of metrics we'll capture will be looking at economic loss, so how these flood levels in a probabilistic framework drive future loss in terms of dollars, and how that will change in these future conditions. We'll be providing descriptive products, exposure statistics, and some illustrative map products, because we're looking at a bunch of different receptors, and not all those lend themselves to perfect economic analysis that we can accomplish in the time frame, but we'll be doing the best we can with the resources and the time we have. And I guess next slide, and I think we'll have Dale talk about the strategy and evaluation process.
Great, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Admiral Phillips. Thank you, Chair McClellan and members of the commission. My name is Dale Morris. As Ann mentioned, Director of Partnerships for the Water into the Gulf. And I'm a Virginia resident, and the Water into the Gulf has been working with Louisiana, which is on its 4th iteration of a coastal master plan. So we have some experience and lessons learned and things to suggest that Virginia should not do. So when we talk about a master plan, the idea is actually not to do a plan, but to build stuff, to get structures, whether gray or green, into the ground that's going to protect people in place and capital. And so I want to talk a little bit about that with this master plan. So the Dewberry team, we're working with one of the TAC subcommittees, the Project Identification Subcommittee, which has issued a data call and is parsing existing databases from the PDCs, from the regional commissions, from municipalities, and from some other state, sub-state government entities. Their database is available to us from the Virginia Coastal Management System, and from VIMS and other stakeholders like Wetlands Watch and Conserve Virginia, and even parsing some ideas that may be floating around regarding coastal storm risk management and ecosystem restoration projects that the Corps of Engineers has pondered, or people have asked the Corps to ponder. Again, it's all about projects here. And so once we get that database of projects available or ready, we will go through we'll go through an initial baseline screening. Some of those factors that we'll look at there will, is the project that we've identified here, is it within the framework and principles of the master plan? Is it within the identified master plan region? Do they align with the master plan vision, which we've described as protecting and preserving Virginia's way of life, its economy, its natural environment, and its cultural and historic assets, and by enhancing the resilience of communities, regions, and the natural and built infrastructure in the face of climate change and sea level rise. Will the projects, do they provide structural, non-structural, or nature-based solutions, flood reduction benefits? Are they duplicative or overlapping? Is there sufficient info and data on the project to evaluate the project? What is the project status? Is it just an idea? Is it a conceptual plan? Is it in planning or design, or is it under construction? And we'll order with that. And after this initial screen, if we identify promising projects for which there is insufficient information, we will try to fill some of those data gaps. And at the end of that process, of this ID process, we'll have an inventory. And of course, then we want to move forward. Next slide, please. Then we want to move forward and evaluate the projects. And the project evaluations will be conducted against 4 key factors and a number of metrics. And the 4 key factors are resilient design. Is the project resilient to sea level rise? Is it resilient to climate change? We know for a fact that nature-based solutions are more adaptive, and so resiliency will matter there. We'll look at another factor we'll look at is the extent of benefits. Will the project have social benefits and benefits for the builder in the natural environment? Does the project deal with equity? Will it have positive impacts for disadvantaged communities throughout the Commonwealth within the master plan designated region? And is the project, or are the suite of projects, are they implementable? Can they be funded? Does the sponsor have capacity to implement and oversee? And will the project be completed in a reasonable timeframe? And then we'll do an analysis against a number of metrics. The metrics are not yet final, and they'll be finalized with the Commonwealth leaders and with the TAC and its project evaluation subcommittee. And these metrics are sort of understandable: flood risk reduction, impact on habitats and natural infrastructure, impacts upon community and social equity, project timeliness, project complexity, permitting ease, and cost effectiveness, and things like that. The evaluation will ideally take place through quantitative analysis, although we do think that would be a little bit more of a challenge for this first iteration of the master plan, given data availability or the lack thereof, and given the quick speed with which we have to do this. When quantitative analysis won't work, we'll be looking at qualitative analysis and perhaps looking at other outcomes and benefits from the project. We can also work through expert analysis and participatory scoring. And at the end of this, we'll have a prioritized list of projects for funding, and hopefully we can work with the state with the funding strategy to get things built for communities around Virginia. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale. As we get to that list of prioritized projects, one thing we want to do is make sure there's mechanisms to take them from projects to implemented projects that can be built and constructed and come into place to aid and assist in the resilience of the state. As part of the overall study process, we are completing a funding analysis where we want to look out there and look at the opportunities for funding across the federal, state, local opportunities, funding resources, as well as an array of other innovative opportunities. Work to catalog those so we understand the eligibility of the different types of projects that'll be in the project catalog, and also requirements and attributes that the owners of those projects may have. So we can align the two. And this comes into what project types are eligible for certain sources, the maximum amount of money available for them versus the cost of the project. We know multiple streams may be needed for many projects, and then assessing the eligibility of certain types of applicants for these projects, how much of a lift it is to try to apply for these grants and other funding opportunities. Is the juice worth the squeeze, I think we'd like to say there. And then what we go through at that point would be a matching exercise, leveraging the attributes that we're collecting about the projects, who owns them, what their participation is, type of community, social equity, and all those other pieces, and how do they match up with the funding sources, as well as when these projects are expected to be built, what phase they're in, et cetera, to try to line up many different funding opportunities to move these forward, and not just from a single source, from the, what's out there across the funding landscape in these days, which is ever evolving. And then aspects of what we're doing are listed over to the right, from gap analysis of some of this existing stuff to looking at equity for different communities and opportunities across the state. And next slide, please. As we work through all these different pieces, as we said, we're pulling this information into the master plan. The products of the overall study will kind of be three different pieces, but two of them are kind of similar. We have the plan document, which will communicate the purposes, the vision, the update of what the state's trying to accomplish here. They'll be backed up by technical appendices, so we have transparency about what data we used to do this and how we did it. We want to make sure we document what are the lessons learned from this initial master plan, the gaps in information, what are the needs to improve some of this information to improve the plan in the future, and how can the methods be improved, et cetera. We're establishing a database for these projects that can be used by the state and adaptable to other purposes, especially as funding calls come in, to be able to sort the project list and align those projects with those funding calls. And finally, an online application that will allow users to interact with the outputs and the data of the study. Next slide, Ann. Thank you. And finally, throughout the study, we're working to have outreach and engagement. We have some goals here where we not only want to build some awareness of what the state's doing with the Coastal Master Plan, what the goals, the vision are, how it will benefit everybody in the long run, but also to hear from the stakeholders about what their hurdles are, what their needs are, what's keeping them back from having some of these projects move forward, and then some success stories too that the state can build on to share and build capacity across the state, and of course disseminate some of our outcomes and findings. And this will be conducted across an array of stakeholders, from the planning districts down to the public, and including our federal military partners, tribes, etc. And I'll leave it to you to close this out. Thank you.
So thank you, everyone. And thank you again to Brian and Dale for their participation and their time, and all of the work that we are doing and will do together to reiterate the benefits to the Commonwealth in taking this particular holistic master plan process under consideration, or the ability to look across government and society and community to ensure that we include equitable solutions in our process, and that we are not leaving communities behind, and helping build capacity where that's a need, taking this broader view to be inclusive and considering of solutions and opportunities from a broad perspective across coastal regions of the Commonwealth, and then helping to identify focused finance strategies to be able to move forward and take project ideas into project implementation. 2 additional comments before we take your questions. Brian, Dr. Batten mentioned the Technical Advisory Committee, which was established by Executive Order 71 in December. There are 26 named members. We may also appoint additional technical experts. We have added an additional 15 people. There are 7 subcommittees, all of which are advising the Commonwealth and then coordinating and working with Dewberry in their contracting role to advise on the work as we move forward. All of these meetings are public. You may participate in them. They are noticed. They are on the Commonwealth calendar, and they follow all of the FOIA and public meeting processes. And second, we are doing a considerable public outreach effort over the summer. You will hear from us again in the context of conducting that outreach in the Hampton Roads and other coastal regions of Virginia as we move forward. And we're thrilled to get to that point, and honored to be a part of this process for the Commonwealth. And we're happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Phillips, Mr. Batten, and Mr. Morris. Great plan. It's a lot to be done in a very short period of time. Godspeed.
Thank you.
Grateful that we have a lot of good input from the Hampton Roads region, which will be very much affected by this. I can't help but think about the work that this PDC has done in advance of this with the inventory that we started a few years ago as a sort of foundational to this effort. But with that said, I'd like to open it up to my fellow commissioners for questions and input. And or our state delegation who is joining us as well. Ms. Danaher?
Yep, can't keep me quiet. That was fascinating. And I'm wondering how this information can be further disseminated throughout the communities so that people who are not watching this meeting can access your information.
Thank you, ma'am. So we have a couple of different ways that we're working on that right now. And of course, vision planning and consulting is helping us in that context, developing outreach tools and packages and methods by which we may spread the word more broadly across the community. However, all of this is posted on and accessible on the Secretary of Natural Resources webpage. There is a coastal resilience site. There is a technical advisory committee page, and we have built but do not yet have posted a master plan page as well, so people can see what the progress is in that context as we move forward. And as we get ourselves up and running through the summer here, we're focusing on a series of basic public outreach opportunities through various media forms so that the public has a better awareness of what we're doing and an understanding of the fact that their input is going to be a part of this now and in the future. So this is just the beginning of that work. But so that's coming soon, and some of it is actually started, and we'll be doing more and more as we work through the summer and get to the point where we're ready to start working with the public in noticing and notifying them of what we're doing.
Admiral Phillips, do you have of all the committees that you'd had, I apologize, perhaps it was there, an engagement committee, an outreach committee?
Yes, there is an outreach and engagement committee. It is chaired by someone some of you might know, Ashley Montgomery, who's been very active in this region. She is a graduate of Hampton University and now works for an architect and engineering firm in Norfolk. Has considerable experience working the Chesterfield Heights and projects at Hampton and other places. So some of you probably know her. And Director David Paler is the vice chair of that subcommittee. And there are 12 members who are actively engaged in contributing their suggestions and advice on outreach opportunities and helping us build this strategy as we move forward.
Great. Are there any other comments, questions? I know that there's a whole portion related to funding. And along those lines, at this point, that's going to be a big piece of the puzzle for sure. And I know that we as our staff and the various commissioners and municipalities have been providing input on the funding mechanism from Reggie. And so we're excited to see where that goes as well. And that guidance, while it's not a part of the coastal master plan, it is complementary. And I don't know if you want to give us any update on that, Admiral Phillips.
The public comment period for the guidelines for the grant manual for the actually closed May 12th. And we have a number of public comments, and the Department of Conservation and Recreation is working through those. They are the owners of this Community Flood Preparedness Fund, which is a statewide fund, which can in part support coastal adaptation, of course. And so we're still working on a process to move forward with that grant manual, releasing it in the early summer. So we're nearly to early summer, and we're nearly to releasing the grant manual. So as we resolve comments and move forward, more information will follow there, but that's the timeline that we're on. So thank you all for a number of comments came in from the Hampton Roads region, from localities, from individuals, and from other stakeholders. So we're grateful for that. Thank you.
Mr. Crum, I want to recognize you in just one second, though. I have a quick question, which was, I noticed in the hazards that you, Brian, you talked about this sort of the grayed out precipitation piece. So with that context, would a project, for example, in Virginia Beach that dealt with stormwater infrastructure for the area that was hit hard by Hurricane Matthews, would that not then be considered as part of this coastal master plan as a result, because it's stormwater and precipitation related?
I think the answer to that question at this point is it depends. We're still building our evaluation criteria, and we're still building how we will evaluate processes. And to some extent, it'll be, based on the vulnerability of assets that particular project might protect and the risk to those assets over time. We're developing a process that will help us consider things in that way. I would also add that we know we don't have time to do rainfall this time to the extent that we would like to, particularly look at compound flooding, but we wrote into the contract the capacity to scope that work and also the capacity to begin to execute it as a follow-on project to this one. So we would like to get that started before the end of the Northam administration, because we know that is so critical to coastal Virginia's understanding of what's actually happening here at the confluence of rainfall, nuisance flooding, storm surge flooding, and wind-driven flooding, and the many complexities that are part of life and water, particularly in Hampton Roads, but in the rural coastal regions and really across coastal Virginia.
Thank you. Mr. Crum?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Just two things. First, I wanted to make a connection for the commission to our discussion last month about the anticipated federal infrastructure program coming in the fall, hopefully. And we began to discuss last month some large-scale regional infrastructure needs that we had. And you'll recall that we were talking about sea level rise mitigation, just thinking about the projects in Hampton, in Norfolk, in Virginia Beach, we got over $4 to $5 billion very quickly in terms of need. Admiral Phillips and team, I just wonder, clearly this type of a systematic plan should be able to position us, I would think, in terms of not only stating the need, but talking about opportunities for how we move forward collectively. And I got to think will make us more competitive when the time comes for a federal infrastructure package to seek funding for some of these critical projects. I just sort of want to bring that up. Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's it's absolutely a part of the thought process. We're seeing at the federal grant level an interest in states being able to prioritize. Is this the most important project in this context? Or is this, how does this fall out in the state's priorities overall? And so states that have the capacity to do that are going to be in a better position than states that don't. And we're also seeing federal grants beginning to build on each other. So FEMA and NOAA are working together on their grants, the BRIC grants and NOAA's resilience grants. So there'll be an opportunity to be able to, if we can show how one grant application is building capacity to lead to the opportunity to apply for another kind of grant, a NOAA grant might lead to a FEMA grant, those opportunities will be of value too. And the ability to have that laid out and to have thought through it at the state level will be of great value to us.
And Madam Chair, if I may, maybe a question for our commission members. You heard Admiral Phillips and the team talk about the need as they get into the summer for outreach. I know all of you with your constituent meetings, city managers, Ms. Bunning and others, that you have ways that you're able to reach out to your communities that work very well. I just wonder if any of you as commissioners have ideas that you could connect Admiral Phillips and her team to in terms of how we take the word about this important planning effort to your constituents so that they're able to engage. So just wanted to perhaps run that out there as a question.
Well, I'd like for everybody to possibly think about this and come back to the group and continue to submit information. This is really critical to our region. I appreciate the hard work that you have done and the extraordinary hard work that you are about to embark upon in this timeline. So we really appreciate that. At this point, Mr. Com, as I mentioned previously, with apologies to the rest of the commission, I have to pass the baton over to Vice Chair David Jenkins because I've got to get to another event. So I'm going to turn this over ably to Vice Chair Jenkins, and you can run the rest of the meeting, my friend.
Thank you. I'll do the best I can, and bear with me since this will be my first time. Bob, where are we and where do we proceed from here?
So I think Vice Chair Jenkins, I think for you to determine if we need any more conversation about the coastal master plan, if you think we've had sufficient conversation, we could thank our guests for that presentation and move on to our next item.
Certainly. I think we've had the start of a good discussion today, and I look forward to continuing it. And I do want to thank our guests for that wonderful presentation.
Admiral Phillips and team, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, all of you, and for the opportunity. We look forward to continuing the dialogue.
Well, Mr. Jenkins, what I'd like to recommend is that we move on to our next item. This is an item we're excited to share with the commission. We have with us today Ms. Sharnita Bethea, who is the housing administrator here at the HRPDC. Sharnita is going to provide our commission some background information on our regional housing program that we're really proud of, and then an exciting opportunity for grant funding that might be able to help some of our jurisdictions with your housing initiatives. So Sharnita, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bob. Vice Chair Jenkins and other distinguished members of our commission and guests, good afternoon. I will try to be brief. I know that we are kind of tight for time, so I'm going to roll through some of these a little quick so that we'll have an ample amount of time to kind of talk through a regional opportunity that I think a lot of the jurisdictions will find very helpful. So I want to talk a little bit about just overall about our Housing and Human Services program. It's been a few years since I've updated the group, and I wanted to provide a little bit of background for new members of our commission to know a little bit more about the work that we do internally. I want to take an opportunity to talk and get a little bit of your feedback regarding our current housing market, some of the things that we see on the horizon that will be critical that we start some necessary dialogue now in order to prevent some problems that we may see down the road in terms of affordability, foreclosures, and evictions. And of course, on a lighter side, talk about a unique funding opportunity that was presented to us from Virginia Housing, and see how we can make that opportunity work as we look at strengthening our workforce housing in the region. A little bit about the Housing and Human Services Department. The majority of our work works with jurisdictions in a regional effort called Home Funds, that we are able to give down payment and closing cost assistance to first-time home buyers in the region. We also serve on many boards and committees in terms of capacity for advisory boards, for other issues as it relates to housing, human services, older adult priorities, as well as persons with disabilities, and how we can further strengthen capacity in the region for that. We also staff support the Hampton Roads Housing Consortium. That organization has been in existence since 1996. Ultimately, it was formed to be a vehicle to provide regional coalition as it relates to bringing in funds from the state down to more regional levels so that we could better serve the constituents in our region. A lot of times when people call our organization and they ask for the housing department, little do they know that the housing department actually consists of two people. So it's me as a housing administrator, and it's Deidre Garrett, which is our housing specialist. I'm glad that we give the impression that it's a whole team of 10 or 15, but we're a two-man, two-woman show, and we do pretty much most of the work. Deidre Garrett works directly with our regional programs as it relates to first-time home buyers. I cover more of the initiatives as it relates to the advisory boards and capacity for our local providers. So that's the team. If you call and ask for that department, you're gonna have a 50% chance of talking to one of us. I want to talk a little bit about the down payment and closing cost program and why it's so important in some of the work that we have done. We provide down payment and closing costs to low and moderate consumers in our region for home ownership. That covers pretty much most of their, if not all, of their closing costs, and give them enough money to provide a safe amount towards their down payment. Pretty much there are two impediments to home ownership for the average consumer. It's either credit or their access to getting the necessary funding to support their home ownership goal. This is given into a grant or a loan, as we call it. It is tied to a 5-year forgivable grant, which means if the client stays in the home for 5 years, the grant is considered paid in full. And that also gives our clients a little bit of equity so that they are building wealth as they proceed on. The clients are required to provide at least 1% of their own funds to the transaction to ensure that they have a little bit of skin in the game and they have a little bit of ownership in the process in terms of what their ownership is as it relates to being comfortable with making their payments each month. Generally, eligibility, they have to be, of course, a first-time home buyer, which HUD states is someone who has not had ownership within 3 years. This program is ran at 80% of the area median income. So for a household size of 4, that's approximately $67,600 that they have to, the maximum amount that they can make for a family of 4. And they must be able to qualify for a standard first mortgage program. One of the program requirements is that we are not getting our clients into any negative amortization, that they are not going to be subject to any predatory lending practices. So we ensure that the mortgages that they are securing will be affordable and within their spending plan and their goal of home ownership. These are our service areas that we particularly cover. We are the direct home recipient for down payment and closing costs for Chesapeake, Portsmouth, Isle of Wight County, and Smithfield. We also support the Regional Loan Fund for assistance with James City County, Gloucester, Poquoson, York County, and Williamsburg. We also know that it's very important that we partner with other regional organizations with their particular program. So Deidre and I provide a lot of information and referral to Norfolk, Suffolk, Newport News, and Hampton's programs. They are directly funded for home in those. So in most cases, we are doing a lot of referral between programs, and we have to collaborate a lot of times because most clients are willing to live in multiple jurisdictions. So we're constantly going back and forth between our jurisdictions to ensure that the consumer is finding the best home for them. I wanted to give you all an idea of the type of clients that we serve. Mr. Keaton and I had a wonderful conversation about the term workforce housing, how you hear the term workforce housing, how you hear affordable housing, and what type of connotation that brings to light. What I decided to do was to have Ms. Garrett kind of pull up a couple of the last transactions that we did to give you an idea of what we see as a first-time home buyer and what is considered in our region workforce housing. The first resident that we worked with recently was in the city of Chesapeake. She was living in Currituck County and commuting back and forth to her job in Chesapeake, mother of three, a logistics coordinator for our local manufacturing company. So this opportunity gave her the ability to move closer to her job, to find a school system that would work with her small three children. And it cut her commute down in terms of being able to live in the city that she was actually working on. We had a 21-year-old, which is almost, I felt like my son, but we started with him. He was a recent apprenticeship program graduate, 21 years old. His parents were ready for him to get out of the home. We worked with him about 6 months. Of course, he was spending, he was eating out, he was going to the movies, he was having a good time. And we talked with him about wealth building and getting his home, and he complied. He hit all of his home ownership goals. And we have a 21-year-old working in, living in Portsmouth, working at the shipyard, and was able to cut down the amount that he would have been spending in rent and become his first home buyer. I call this a success story for Williamsburg in York County. We had a grandmother raising her grandchild, working in York County for years, living in York County for years, and was able to buy her first home right across the border in Williamsburg. 2 generations of being on the Housing Choice Voucher Program, Section 8, and one of the first homeowners in her entire household. So we were extremely proud to have someone over 70 years old look at home ownership as the next goal. And one of the things she shared with us is that she wanted that to be a goal for her grandchild. So we were very happy to be able to assist her. So you see 3 workers in our community that benefited from this program. And we know that this is important as we look at transportation issues in our region and we look at affordable housing, that we want to make sure that the clients that we're serving that's living in our jurisdictions are able to work and live where they are currently. I wanted to talk a little bit and share with you a little bit about what we're looking at in terms of the real estate market. If any of you all have seen the news, had anyone in your family looking at home ownership, we know that it is a seller's market. We know that housing in our area, especially for affordable housing, is far more scarce. I had no idea that we would be even talking about this type of market in COVID. When COVID-19 first hit back in February or March, we were very skeptical on whether or not people would even be in the home ownership or the housing market. Little did we know that in terms of refinancing and in terms of home ownership, this was one of the most record years 2020 was as it related to housing. So what we're seeing right now in terms of real estate is that we have investors and cash offers back online. We have contracts that are ratifying almost $20,000 to $30,000 over asking price. There are no seller concessions and home inspections are being waived. The last contract that we talked with the state on, we actually had buyers actually paying seller concessions, which I have never seen in the 15 years I've been in this business, that we've gotten to the point that sellers are now requiring the mortgages and those opportunities to be paid by the actual buyer. The other piece I want to spend a little bit of time with you all quickly is talking about the looming eviction and foreclosure moratorium. Right now, we're scheduled that the eviction and moratorium will be released on June 30th. Housers, practitioners are hoping that is extended because of the market just really getting back on track and people are really returning to work. But I think it's something that our communities need to start looking at as we relate to that. I want to talk quickly about an opportunity that was presented to the Virginia Planning District Commission's state group. Virginia Housing, formerly known as VHDA, presented an opportunity for planning district commissions across the state to be a little bit more involved with housing opportunities across the state, but especially in our region. This proposed grant will allow us to look at some regional approaches to housing projects and programs, look at how we plan and develop for our workforce housing and our affordable housing, look at exactly how we enhance collaboration between regional organizations and our local organizations that are actually on the ground doing the work of community development and creating affordable housing options in our area, and overall strengthen the capacity to address housing opportunities that were identified in the Virginia Housing Strategic Plan. In that plan, they looked at a couple of different opportunities and strategies, one being, of course, the creation of affordable housing. And another one that may be something that our region needs to look at is how do we repurpose housing existing old schools, existing school churches, to see how we can come up with some collaborative and creative ways to create housing. These are some potential projects that we are looking at. How do we create some housing resiliency, look at ways that we can have some innovational approaches to rural housing? How do we co-locate affordable housing with some of our other things? If you're looking at the uses of churches, the uses of having our nurses be in a walkable community that they're closer to the hospitals, really looking at innovative ways that we can look at how we put housing closer to where people are working. Assisting with our public housing authorities locally with their affordable housing projects, and looking at other creative mixed use development that will create some permanent supportive housing in our region. This is just a breakdown of the potential of what we can apply for. Because of our population being over 600,000, we would apply for the entire 3 million for projects in our region. So I'm thinking that with our entire region, we could definitely spend a great amount of time finding some low-hanging fruit projects in our region. So what we have been doing, these are our next steps. We have been talking with, having some conversations with local housing offices and our other government offices about some projects that you all have been working on within your city and needing some additional gap funding to make those successful. Internally, we're looking at what that framework would be. How do we prioritize projects? How do we see what will give us the most positive input and impact in ensuring that these houses and these affordable housing projects are done? The grant requires that even though we are able to fund potential projects in the region, they have a 3-year process or 3-year term to have those monies expended to ensure that the money is expended within 3 years. Today, what we're doing is we're seeking your approval from the board that once we apply, we can accept this grant funding and move forward with awarding the individual projects in our region with this necessary funding. Again, we have had some initial conversations with many of your housing authorities in your housing departments and have pretty much identified more than 3 million in projects, which is a good thing that we know that we're able to allocate and spend the money. But the housing, Virginia Housing has also indicated to us that if there are any larger programs over 3 million, they are willing to look at and evaluate those projects separately. So we're able to find quite a few projects that we can fund within the 3 million and have identified a couple of larger scale groups that Virginia Housing is willing to come down and work with them separate. So Vice Chair Jenkins, that's all I have right now. If we have the approval of the board, we will continue to prepare the grant application, which is due on June 4th. So we have a very quick turnaround time. And I'll answer any other questions or concerns of any of the quick information. I know it was very quick that we went over today to get your input.
Are there any questions?
So Vice Chair Jenkins, we just think this, first off, Shanita, thank you for your overview. And before we go on, I just want to say, it's amazing to me, here's another department of 2 people, but I always say Shanita and Deidre are really changing people's lives every week with the great work they do. And just that one profile of some of their clients, and you know, these programs, them working with your staffs are really life-changing. So it's something that we're incredibly proud of. So Shanita, thank you for everything that you do. Vice Chair Jenkins, we think this is a fantastic opportunity to move forward. As Shanita said, have the PDC be the applicant for the $3 million. Shanita, I think that while that's not enough to do a project, it's sort of gap funding, right? Could you talk about that for a minute? That you know that a lot of localities have projects happening, they need to advance them to a next step, and this could be money that could help with that. Would that be correct?
Correct. So most of the organizations we talked to, I just kind of looked at how much money they were needing in order to kind of fill that gap. They had already established low-income tax credits. They'd already looked at other grant sources, and we're kind of needing that extra money to make some of those projects go forward. So some of them said I was the fairy godmother when I just called and says, hey, the region has this money. What could we do with it? That rarely happens in housing, that we have additional opportunities that just kind of drop in our lap. So in most cases, that's one of the first things that I spoke with most of the organizations is, what are your low-hanging fruit, the things that if you have additional assistance, we can get off. Again, we identified multi-million-dollar projects that we would need to look at in a different capacity, but this grant itself is just to kind of give that nudge to go forth and do some of that necessary work to get some affordable housing and workforce housing on the ground.
So at this point, I would like to entertain a motion and a second to authorize the HRPDC Executive Director to apply for and accept grant funding from Virginia Housing's REACH, Virginia Resource, to support statewide planning district commissions' housing efforts.
Vice Chair, I apologize. Vice Chair Jenkins, if I may.
Yes.
So you've outlined what we're going to proceed to do. I know the hour is late. If there's no objection to this, Shanita and I will accept direction to proceed as you just outlined, unless there are objections. Could you call for any objections to that? And we could probably not have you have to go through another roll call vote is what I'm trying to do, Mr. Vice Chair.
Sure.
So what Shanita and I would like to do is exactly what you outlined. We would like to proceed and apply for this grant, working with your localities and how it would be distributed. But if there are no objections to that, Shanita, I think that will give us our direction to move forward. Would that be okay? If you could call for any objections and see if there's a consensus.
Are there any objections?
Bob, and this is Frank Rabel. I don't have an objection to it, but I feel like I need to abstain because I didn't see Franklin and Southampton in that area.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Shanita, do you want to talk about any work that you've had with Franklin and Southampton, please?
Yes. So the Franklin and Southampton County, and I have not had an opportunity to talk to Ms. Walkup, they are covered under the Western Tidewater Consortium. That consortium is actually administered through the city of Suffolk. John Brooks actually administers that. So that's a consortium of Isle of Wight County, Smithfield, Franklin, and Southampton. And I have talked with the coordinator for Western Tidewater regarding projects. So it would be inclusive and able to apply if we identify projects in Franklin and Southampton through Mr. Goodwin and Ms. Walker.
And thank you for that clarity. Then I have no objection.
Well, Mr. Vice Chair Jenkins, I think then maybe going once and twice for any concerns. If there are no concerns, Sharnita and I and the team will work towards applying for that money, securing that money. And then Sharnita, next steps would be, I'm sure we'll be talking with the CAOs again and this commission about opportunities, correct?
Correct. So we would, Keith and I would be looking at the prioritization tool of how we assign those funding, and then we'll take it back to the CAOs.
Okay. Right. Well, Mr. Vice Chair, if that sounds like a good path forward, we will move forward accordingly, sir.
Absolutely.
All right. Again, Sharnita, thank you for that overview. And if anybody has any comments to send our way, send to me, send to Keith, send to Sharnita about ideas, opportunities, etc. We'd look forward to that input. Well, Mr. Vice Chair, I'd recommend then I can go through very quickly and just refer to our 3-month tentative schedule. We will not meet in June as a PDC. Our next meeting will be July 15th. You have our advisory committee meeting minutes in your agenda and our technical committee meeting summaries and some items for your information. Sir, if there's no other new or old business, staff does not have any, but we could go ahead and adjourn.
Do I need to ask for a motion and a second on that?
I would just ask for, let's just make certain that no commission members have any new business to bring forward, sir.
Certainly. Does anyone have any new business?
Well, as I was saying to Chair Tuck earlier, it's hard to believe that our next meeting will be by Memorial Day and the 4th of July. So how time flies. But in all seriousness, I just want to pause and thank everybody. It's hard to believe we've been trying to make this all work for 15 months now through this pandemic. And through meetings with CAOs to staff and elected officials, PDC and TPO board, I just want to thank everybody for your patience and dedication to our region as we work through all this together. So thank you so much.
Thank you, and we're adjourned.